In this video I'm going to assemble my new Linear Limo Recumbent bike. This story begins back in March of 2018 when I purchased a used 2005 Linear Recumbent bike. I found this bike extremely comfortable and it was a lot of fun to ride. In 2018 I rode it approximately 5,000 kilometers, including 2 week-long self-supported bike tours around Ontario. Unfortunately, however, after owning this 14-year-old bike for less than a year, I discovered that a crack had formed on one of the welds of the frame. Upon further inspection, I discovered a tiny fatigue crack had also started to form where the rear frame arms meet the main frame tube. Knowing that I wanted to do a lot more riding in 2019, a bike with a cracked frame would not be sufficient. I decided to reach out to Peter Stull, the owner of Linear Recumbents, who I know takes great pride in the structural integrity of the bike frames that his company manufactures. I sent him some photos and he was equally concerned with these cracks. In the 16 years he's owned the company and been making linears in upstate New York, my frame is the only one he's aware of that's ever started to crack. Even though I wasn't the original owner of the bike, he stood by the quality of his product and made me a very generous offer. In exchange for my cracked frame, he gave me a very good deal on the purchase of a brand new frame, which is from the next generation of Linear Recumbent bikes. Most of my existing componentry can be installed on this new frame, with the exception of my rear brake and wheel, because the new frame is designed for disc brakes. So along with the frame, I also bought a new wheel and new brake. So the first thing I needed to do was adapt a new frame to work with my older seat style. The holes for the seat struts are tapped for M5 bolts, but my seat uses these ball studs which have 5/16" threads. I was told that it would be okay to drill the small holes big enough to fit the larger threads, but I'm concerned that this wouldn't leave very much material around the holes and would weaken them too much. So instead I managed to find some similar ball studs which have an M6 thread, which seems like a good compromise between M5 and 5/16". So I started by expanding the holes with my drill and then used my M6 tap to add some threads. As planned, the new ball studs fit in there nicely. While it was added, I decided to cut threads into this other hole here, which will eventually be used for mounting my rear fender. These threads are for an M5 bolt. So when I purchased this frame, it was just bare metal, with no finish applied. I had considered painting it, but given that I'm going to be locking this bike up around the city, I'm sure the paint would get scratched up pretty quickly at the bike racks. Instead of paint, I decided to apply a clear coat over the bare aluminum surface to give the metal some protection, but still hopefully keep the future scratches less visible. Over the course of a week, I gradually sanded all of the surfaces of the frame from 200 grit up to 600 grit. After giving the frame a thorough washing to get rid of all of the aluminum dust, I masked off the inside of the head tube and bottom bracket and applied my clear coat finish. I gave it 2 thin coats, followed by 1 thicker coat, which was recommended on the can. I gave the finish a few days to fully cure, but meanwhile started preparing the wheels. The new wheel I purchased for this bike is 26 inches just like its predecessor, but along the way I discovered that this new frame is also able to accommodate 700C rear wheels. In my experience, 26-inch road tires are a lot less readily available than 700C ones, so I decided that a 700C rear wheel would be a better choice. For Mountain Equipment Co-op, I bought a disc brake compatible 700C rear wheel and transferred my new disc brake rotor to it from the 26-inch wheel that I won't end up using. This rubber strip gets installed in the rim to protect the inner tube from being damaged by the end of the spokes. For using this bike in the city, I'm going to use this tire from my old hybrid bike, but most likely will switch to this gator skin road tire when I take the bike on long distance trips. Next, I installed my 8-speed cassette onto the free hub. So now back on the frame, I'll install my headset cups. I used a piece of threaded rod and some nuts and washers to tightly press the cups in place. Now it's time to install the linear decals. Before installing them, I trimmed a thin sliver from the top of each decal to ensure it wouldn't get damaged when adjustments are made to the seat and steering blocks. Using the bottom edge as a guide, I was able to do a pretty good job installing them straight. Next, I'll install my new disc brake onto the frame with these 2 bolts. To make the bike easier to work on, I'm going to install the cargo rack next. I made some plastic inserts to go inside these cutouts in the frame to give me some smaller holes for mounting the rack to. They're a tight fit, so I used a nut and bolt to press them in place. Before finishing installing the rack, I decided to put the ball studs for the seat back in place. This time I secured them with nylon insert nuts. Now the rack gets installed, starting with the 2 bolts near the dropouts. I used extra long bolts here because later I'm going to mount my fenders onto the end of them. This is a fairly unusual rack that I'm installing, which has its secondary mounting points on the sides rather than on the front. I used pieces of aluminum bar to span the distance between the plastic inserts in the frame and the mounting points on the sides of the rack. To fasten it, I inserted a bolt through a big aluminum washer that I made, which goes through the plastic insert. This then connects with a corresponding hole in the aluminum bar, and a washer and nylon insert nut fastens it in place. After I had done the same with the other side, the rack installation was complete, which meant I could move the bike onto the floor to continue working on it. The next item I'm going to install is the rear fender, which is actually separated into two pieces. This small piece fastens in from the bottom. I decided to modify the fenders to work like this to help ensure there's plenty of clearance between the tire and the fender when a 700C wheel is installed on this bike. The other piece of the fender gets fastened onto the other end of the same bolt with a small nut. The fender stays get fastened in a similar way on the other end of these bolts for the rack. Later I switched these to longer bolts and used nylon insert nuts here. Next I installed the rear derailleur and repositioned the bike slightly. Here I'm installing the bottom bracket cartridge. It gets installed from the drive side of the bike and is a left-hand thread. Then this ring gets installed from the other side, which is a standard right-hand thread. Now the front forks get installed into the headset. I added some grease to the headset cups and inserted the bearing cages. Now the forks get inserted through the hole, and then all the hardware is threaded on to fasten it in place. Later when the bike is flipped back over, I'll give these a proper tightening. Now the front wheel can be installed, followed by the rear wheel. With this wheel in place, I can now adjust the rear fenders to their correct position. The kickstand gets installed in this spot here. Now with that installed, the bike can stand up on its own. Next I'll install the front derailleur onto this tube here. I'm only fastening this loosely for now. These aluminum blocks now get installed, which will support the handlebars and seat. These pins are installed which index the position of the blocks with the frame, but a bolt from the side is truly what will fasten it in place. The handlebars attach to the steering block with a bolt and a thrust bearing above and below them. I applied grease to the thrust bearings and installed everything. Once the appropriate amount of pressure has been applied by the bolt, this set screw is tightened to lock it in place and prevent the bolt from getting unscrewed. Next I connected the rear shift cable to the rear derailleur and also adjusted the limit screws to give this derailleur the correct side-to-side range of motion. Now we'll connect my rear brake cable. Since my new frame uses disc brakes instead of V-brakes, the cable housing for the rear brake isn't quite long enough to reach. I don't happen to have any spare pieces of cable housing which are long enough to span the distance required, so I decided to make this little adapter so I could extend the existing cable with just a short piece. I opened up a new brake cable, cut off one of the end connectors, applied some lube to the cable, and then inserted it through the housing. I'm only loosely attaching the cable to the brake for now, since it'll probably need some further calibration later. The cable for the front derailleur follows this path along the left side of the frame, and then tucks underneath and comes up on the right side. Since I'm not sure I have the positioning of the front derailleur set correctly yet, I'm just loosely connecting this cable for now. The front brake cable follows a similar path along the left side of the frame all the way up to the front wheel. The noodle gets inserted into the brake arm and the cable is fastened in place. Next I'll install the crank arms. These get wedged under the square tapers of the bottom bracket by the bolts. Now the steering linkage gets installed with the quick connects at the front and back. The length of the steering linkage is designed to be adjusted in 1-inch intervals using these holes, which correspond with the 1-inch intervals for the handlebar position. Since this linkage was previously used on a different bike, some fine adjustment is needed to synchronize these holes with the ones in the frame to ensure the wheel is perfectly straight when the handlebars are perpendicular. After this lock nut has been loosened, this end piece can be threaded in or out to the desired position and then locked back in place with the lock nut. Last but not least, a long chain for this bike can be installed. I threaded it all through the correct path in the derailleurs and used my chain tool to press the pin back in place where I had separated it. Before taking the bike downstairs to test ride it, I propped it up with this broom handle, which allowed me to make fine adjustments to the derailleurs and brake to get everything tuned up correctly. Downstairs I installed the seat and took the bike for its very first test ride. As I had been expecting, the seat position is much more reclined than I'm accustomed to. This is because the seat struts fasten in a lower position on the new frame than they did on the old one. I solved this by replacing the lower sections of the seat struts with these much longer ones that I made myself. While it was at it, I also replaced the quick connect ball joints for the struts with these fixed ones. I did this because I was concerned that the quick connect ones had too much play in them after I switched to the M6 ball studs I bought. There were a few other finishing touches I did off camera, including installing these stickers. Although the bike was built in America, I wanted to add the Canadian flag since it was fully assembled here in Canada. I added these zip ties to support the rear derailleur and brake cables. Since I'll be periodically locking this bike up around my city, I installed these security skewers from Delta Cycle in place of the quick release ones. I also designed and 3D printed this custom mount for my action camera. I'm hoping to film lots of narrated cycling videos with it this summer. Assembling this bike has been a really fun project, but I'm glad that it's now finished and on the road. Now that I have a bike with a brand new frame, I'm looking forward to riding it many thousands of kilometers. I hope you enjoyed following along with this assembly video. Please leave a comment below and let me know what you thought, and thanks for watching.